And then once we started, think about Linux in another way. What if you were to count how many processors have been sold for the Raspberry Pi? I'm sure we all have heard of Raspberry Pi. It's a Linux-based OS. It's a $35 computer. Yeah, you probably got one right behind you.
Yep.
It's running
Linux.
Right.
Yep.
And people didn't do that because they wanted to run a desktop software. Some did, but most people were doing it because they wanted to learn programming, or they wanted to learn how they could integrate with other systems. This small, very cheap computer became an incredible tool. And there's a couple of technologies that made that really popular. And one of them was RESTful APIs, this notion of being able to connect to other systems. And that was somewhat, fundamentally facilitated by a software called Node-RED, developed by IBM, put into the open source, like MQTT was developed by Arlen Nipper and IBM, Dr. Andy Stanford Clark, and put into the open source. So now we have, you're starting to see full circle how now we've got software that can run on a given, open platform of some sort of CPU, ARM. It could be, x86, it could be whatever, Intel. But at this point, now we're starting to have software unleash the potential of that CPU. That's the key. We've built a lot of products with RTOSs, real-time operating systems, on custom silicon. We've done that a lot. We've used Intel, we've used Motorola, we've used a lot of different CPUs with an RTOS on it. And it's been very powerful for us. I mean, we have customers running applications all over the world with it. But it's a finite landscape. I can only do so much. So when we decided that we wanted to move to platforms like Linux and use some of these other tools, what we found is a lot of breathing room. Let's get the task done at hand, reliably in an industrial package. You can count on it to work all the time, but it gave us room to say, okay, what's next? What can we look at down the road? And the timing couldn't really be better. I mean, with all the talk about digital transformation, now you've got a way of democratizing data using this software on that kind of silicon, open silicon, and open OSs. So that's been pretty interesting. And then it kind of came again full circle, reaching back, to MQTT, which was created in 1999. But now with Arlen Nipper and Cirrus Link Solutions, they got the spark plug payload specification for MQTT. And now you're seeing the uptake of MQTT with Sparkplug has been remarkable over the past several years. Not to say that it hasn't been without a lot of effort. Arlen's team has been working on this since 2007. So they've been, when that moved into the open source, and then 2014 is when, I think it was 2014 when Cirrus Link got together. But my point behind this is it solves real problems relative to cybersecurity, relative to data democratization, and you've got other elements, other software companies, other hardware manufacturers, starting to implement these same protocols. So now we can actually build an ecosystem. You look back to OPC, what we're trying to do. Now we're doing it with MQTT, with Sparkplug, and allowing systems to start interoperate. And there's other, we're not the only ones. PLC Next, a great example. I love what those guys are doing. Yeah, they're a competitor, but they have the same train of thought. How can we take these kinds of technologies and products and put them together to address the problems that we face in our industry for democratizing data and securing systems? So indeed, that's been a pretty important one. And then just because we love Raspberry Pi so much, we actually made a board. This probably looks similar to the Optomux from the 80s. It's the same IO, the same board, but we built a Pi carrier board. So you can put your Pi right on top of that thing, and the Pi does all the control. I wouldn't put this in an industrial environment for long-term controls, but we have a lot of people doing this outside of industrial automation. And it's pretty cool. But again, showing the power of silicon CPUs that you can get from anywhere. And then once you got the CPU, you got the OS, now I can start running other interesting software on the same box. And that's why we worked with Ignition, and we're the first company to ship a product with Ignition Edge on board, where these devices next to me here are running Ignition Edge. And they're running a lot, Node-RED, they're running all this stuff because each of those software things, it's like an app on your phone, right? You got a phone, it could be Android, it could be an Apple, it doesn't really matter, but it has all this software, and you choose the software based on the application or based on what you want to do. Why can't industrial systems, be something like that? Why can't they borrow some of those ideas? And that's what these systems are doing. Some of our competitors, of course, again, PLC Next and others are starting to do this as well, where they allow you to not only run software like Ignition or Node-RED, but also your own applications, right?
Yep.
So now I have shell access. I can get in there. I can write a program in Python or C and run it on, again, these same hardware platforms.
And I think that's, a very important point of discussion. I think that in part why, well, I guess there's two things, but the Linux platform became so successful because it is at the core open source, right? And that's where we're seeing a lot of the software being developed nowadays going, versus maybe a bit less in the manufacturing space, or it's just catching on. But I think it allows the user to select the platforms or even the software that runs on top of it, or even modify the OS. Like you said, you can go into the command line, into the shell, and then you can make any changes that you'd like. And same for even the Raspberry Pi. You can go and there's maybe 10 or even more hundreds of different flavors of Linux that you can download depending on your application. And similarly, again, I think you've made this point where you said that you can choose what's right for the application, but you don't necessarily have to be the one developing each and every solution, right? So you can develop
Right
the
on the money.
core that makes sense, and then let the user, based on their application, decide what they want to load in their specific, again, project. So I think like that's a very important aspect of the success I think that Linux is having.